Hello, everyone, and welcome to Our Whole Lives Taking Flight webinar series. My name is Amy Johnson. I am the Minister for Sexuality, Education, and Justice serving in the national setting of the United Church of Christ. Today, we will be talking about Autism-Inclusive Our Whole Lives, and we are thrilled to have some guests with us, and we welcome you to this edition of All Taking Flight. I am also joined by my dear friend and colleague, Melanie Davis. I'll allow her to introduce herself and also our guests. You're muted, Melanie.
Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, wherever you're checking in from. I am Dr. Melanie Davis, the OWL Program Manager with the Unitarian Universalist Association. And I would like to give a shout out to the UCC for creating that beautiful video montage that begins our taking flights now. And I would like to throw the microphone to Ramon Selove, our guest.
Hi, I'm Ramon Selove, recently retired professor of anatomy and physiology. Actually, I just got elected professor emeritus, so I can start saying that now. From Lord Fairfax Community College, except that the Commonwealth of Virginia has decided that some of our old names are not such great ones anymore, and we're in the midst of changing Lord Fairfax to Laurel Ridge. So I taught OWL to high schoolers for, I don't remember how many years, many. And my wife and I have been doing trainings for OWL facilitators for, how long has it been, 10 years?
I think we had that, I think that you were trained maybe in 2013.
Yeah, it's almost 10.
Yeah.
And my wife, Shellie, and my son, Nathan, are joining us from a vehicle en route, and so I'll let them introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Shellie Selove, and let's see, I am a psychotherapist in private practice, also a certified sex therapist through American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. And a sex educator. I've taught the psychology of human sexuality at college level. Raymond and I believe, worked with senior youth OWL for maybe 13 years. And then I think you're right, it is about 9 years that we have been trainers of facilitators for junior youth and senior youth OWL. And that's it for me.
I'm Nathan Selove. I'm their son. I am currently a professor of communication studies at James Madison University, and I come here as an autistic, but also an autistic that took our whole lives as both a junior youth and a senior youth. So I definitely feel like I come at it with a pretty good perspective from the point of view of somebody who has witnessed firsthand the importance of taking disability into account when teaching human sexuality, and when it comes to just running the overall program of our whole lives.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And boy, you all have OWL in the family going on there. Good job. So I wanted to just say a couple of logistic things. First of all, as Raymond said, Shellie and Nathan are in a vehicle, and that's why their video is off. And they may at some point need to exit the webinar. So if that happens, that's what's going on there. But we will have them for as long as we can, and we really appreciate them being here today. If you have questions, as always, we ask you to please use the Q&A feature as opposed to the chat, because it's much easier for us to monitor those questions in the Q&A. So if you could please do that, we'd appreciate it. And with that, let's get started, Melanie.
Well, I'm going to start by reminding folks, a couple years ago, Raymond and I did a General Assembly workshop on this topic. And I am going to post in the chat a link to that where you can find that webinar if you want to watch it later. There's a green box on that page. It's the Inclusion Resources page. So there might be some information that we don't cover today. You want to go back and watch that webinar that's there. So, so why are we here today? Especially to talk about OWL and autism. You know, one of the OWL values and one of the values that the UCC and the UUA share is inclusion, making sure that everybody is able to participate in all parts of our worship and programming. And when we say everybody, we mean everybody. And that means I wouldn't even know that we call it accommodations. We create welcoming spaces, and we try to do that proactively. Let's start about talking about, Raymond, you had about why Our Whole Lives in particular is especially important for folks on the spectrum.
So autism spectrum disorder is a lot of different things, and it shows up differently in different people. But one of the things that is common about it is impairments in communicating with other people, especially nonverbal communication, sometimes verbal communication too. And one of the ways it's sometimes described is mind blindness. People with autism often have difficulty understanding what's in someone else's mind in the way that other people seem to be able to do naturally. That can be really important in communication because a lot of times people don't actually say what they mean. They say something totally different than what they mean, and then kind of try to use body language to cue you in that what they really mean is different. That's sort of the neurotypical way of saying it. The way we autistics would say it is people lie all the time.
And by the way, that is especially important. That kind of communication is especially important with regard to sexuality and sexual interactions with other people.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Shellie.
Yeah, when it comes to sexuality, people lie all the time anyway, but when it comes to sex, they lie all the time. And so it can be really confusing for anyone. One of the really valuable things about Our Whole Lives is the focus on communicating clearly. It's more than just the enthusiastic consent concepts and things like that, but that's a really important part of it. Those things, as important as they are for everybody else, become even more critical for people with autism. That's the fundamental nature of our disability. And to have that acknowledged and the training focus on accommodating that, that really makes a huge difference. It was one of the things that really struck me when I first started teaching Our Whole Lives with high school. There was an exercise that involved pairs of students trying to communicate different things without using words. And it was really transformative for me watching people trying to do that and realizing they were really trying to communicate. And even though a lot of them were really good at that nonverbal communication, it wasn't working.
Mm-hmm.
For those of us on the autism spectrum, it even more doesn't work. And so that's part of it. Another part of it, though, is I feel like people on the autism spectrum are at particular risk of being misunderstood. And for innocent behaviors to be misinterpreted as predatory, And it can be really hard for us to understand how people are misunderstanding us.
Hmm.
And so the training in our whole lives, I just think is really valuable for that. And it was one of the reasons that Shellie and I were so interested in having Nathan take part in it. We were worried about him.
Did you find that you needed to adapt the curriculum anyway? Like when you were facilitating, did you do anything differently if you knew that you had people on the spectrum in the room? Like, were there parts of the communication activities, or were there activities that you adapted because they involved touch or?
So
Hi.
go ahead, Shell.
With regard to autism spectrum, really, so many of the exercises and the culture and the process of OWL was so helpful for people on the spectrum. The check-ins and the conversation about people taking care of themselves when they needed to. One thing that we do, and we do this for the trainers and facilitators, but we did this also when working with the youth, is talk about people taking care of their needs ahead of time, and the fact that sometimes there are needs that conflict with each other related to either disabling conditions or what have you, and giving people an opportunity to do what they needed to do, but also an opportunity to understand that sometimes that can be problematic. And the health of the community was such that we could talk about those things as they came up.
Well, that actually leads into something that that we covered in the General Assembly workshop, which was ground rules. Yes. And how to set group covenant or ground rules that work for everybody in the space. And Raymond, as I recall, you were saying something about stimming, and that it was helpful to sort of give permission for folks. And maybe you could explain what stimming is and how that would work in a ground rule or just everyday situation.
So stimming is an activity, often a repetitive activity that people with autism do. And the reason we do it is generally to try to control sensory input. It's about helping us concentrate on things. It can look very differently in different people. Everybody has their own stims that they kind of develop based on what works for them and what doesn't. One of the classics is the hand flapping, and sometimes it's walking around, sometimes it's making some kind of visual in front of eyes. Sometimes it's being on the phone, doing it. So Shelley's not autistic, but for her, she does Sudoku puzzles on the phone, and it helps her concentrate on what she's doing. Now, the idea that someone could be doing a Sudoku puzzle and concentrating on what you're telling them, that might seem bizarre, but sometimes that works for people. And you can't necessarily know in advance what it's going to work for somebody. So you can't very easily have preset ground rules. You really have to let them evolve from the group that you're in. But I want to really caution you not to adopt a general set of ground rules like I often see in public school classrooms, like no telephones or no earphones or no hats or no chewing gum. I don't know. There's all kinds of things that they try to regulate that you just wonder, why are they trying to regulate that? Yeah, Shell, go ahead.
The ground rules that are generally suggested through our whole lives are great. We just give folks the opportunity to talk about their needs and how to negotiate those and compromise and discuss when those things conflict. Nathan had something to say.
Yeah, also, to sort of emphasize Dad's point, one of the things that everybody needs to understand is you met one autistic, you met one autistic. So we can talk about some general rules for ways of, being more inclusive, creating a better environment. But at the end of the day, it is going to be individualized to your specific group, to Dad's point, because different autistics are going to have different needs. Sometimes the accommodations that one autistic might require could potentially directly conflict with another autistic who happens to be in the room, or maybe the way one autistic acts can sometimes cause another to, can sometimes cause sensory issues with another. It's very common that you have different needs based on the individual person. So the biggest thing you want to take from this is you need to be communicating directly with the members of the class that are actually on the spectrum, so that you can come up with a plan cooperatively, not just a one size fits all.
And then I had one more thing to add, and I appreciated you graciously talking about Nathan Raymond, the using Sudoku puzzles. I'm not really neurotypical. I have ADHD, I have a lot of things too, and that's something that helps me. I wanted to address, I recall at different times, one example of making an adjustment is that we have had students in the past who had learning disabilities and who had difficulty with the paper pencil kind of exercises, and we made some adjustments for those, kind of in answer to your much earlier question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's my dog is going to go nuts any minute. I have a bird feeder attached to my living room window, and there appears to be a squirrel in it. So if things go crazy, I might turn my mic off and disappear. I'm curious, though. I think the idea of when you're making accommodations, and this could be for any kind of person in the program, but if you're making accommodations for one person and they conflict with the accommodations that somebody else needs, how do you manage that? What can you help people take away from how to manage that?
So one of the things that Shellie and I usually include in our list of ground rules is the rather simple phrase, take care of yourself. And but we describe what we mean by that. A lot of times people with autism have spent most of their life self-censoring their stims because they've been told over and over that looks autistic, or it bothers other people, or you can't do that in public, or whatever. And so sometimes people with autism will find ourselves spending so much time trying to control ourselves and follow the rules, we have no idea what's going on. And so the take care of yourself is about giving people permission to do what they have to do in order to be truly present. And everybody needs to agree to do that, because if, for example, I have a stim, like I have to pace back and forth in the back of the room in order to pay attention, I might be reluctant to do that because I'm afraid it's going to bother somebody. If everybody has agreed in advance that they are going to take care of themselves, one of the things that means is that if my stim bothers somebody, that they have promised that they will let me know, so that instead of self-censoring in case I'm bothering somebody, I'll know for sure if I'm actually bothering somebody. And then when we know that I'm bothering somebody with my stim, we can try to negotiate it out. I can try to modify my stim, maybe my position. We can try to figure out something where
Yeah.
I can get what I need, but the person who's bothered by it can still get what they need.
Right, and so part of that is encouraging a dialogue about it. Actually asking the person who's sharing, hey, that pacing is bothering me. Okay, and really great problem solving. Do you have some suggestions that might be helpful to you? A way that this person who the pacing is very helpful to, is there a way that this person could pace a different part of the room, a different energy, a different time? So it really is asking each of the involved parties to give feedback in terms of what works, what might work to find a compromise.
I just think that's so brilliant because it's such great modeling for any kind of communication in any relationship, right? To not assume, to not pre-censor myself, to have responsibility go all ways and not just one way. And especially for facilitators and trainers, I think too, as we're talking about our whole lives trainings, but especially in programs with teens, to not assume that all the behavior that may typically be judged as not paying attention is actually that, and to check in and find out if there's a reason that somebody needs to do that, and to have those kinds of conversations. And I would even say, I know sometimes our facilitators get concerned that if they take a break from content to have those kind of conversations, they're not going to get through all the content. And I just want to say right up front, that conversation that you have about negotiating people's needs and communication is way more important than any exercise in the Our Whole Lives curriculum, bar none.
Well,
I'm going to
And
blanket
it
say
is
that.
the heart
thank
of what
you, Amy.
OWL is about.
So I wanted to add, going back to what you were saying, Amy, that when I'm working with, and I do specialize in working with neurotypical, non-neurotypical folks, neurodivergent folks, and how I know that someone is paying attention during a session is in my interactions. Are they responding in appropriate ways? Is it clear that they actually hear me? I know it's a little bit harder to do that in the context of an OWL group setting, but there are ways to do that. And I think the actual conversation about when someone needs to be fidgeting with something in order to help them actually attend to what we're talking about and have that discussed in the community, I think helps everyone. And that check-in about making sure that they are still there or are still engaged is helpful. But I think it's helpful for everyone to know, oh, that's just how this person is remaining connected and engaged with what we're discussing.
I would say also, I think it behooves the people who are neurotypical or not disabled to practice also self-regulating their responses. I was leading a facilitator training one time, and everybody sits in a big circle. There's space in between the chairs, and somebody was really irritated by a person next to them who had one of those fidget spinners. The fidget spinner was so quiet that, when I was walking around the room, I never heard it, but it really bothered the person sitting next to the person who needed to fidget. And they complained to me, and I said, well, how about moving your chair? Because you don't have to sit where you're sitting. You can move your chair. But this person thought that it was the responsibility of the person who needed to fidget to change their behavior. And so I think that we need to remember that we need to be including everybody in the practicing the self-care and making the modifications they need to make. And to Amy's point, helping facilitators, not just the participants, but helping facilitators have the flexibility to say, well, we don't always have to sit in the same chair. You can move around if you need to move around, So yeah, I think that's important. I wonder, Nathan, if you had anything you wanted to add on this topic.
specifically about STEMs?
Well, about, feeling comfortable in a space, like how, because we have facilitators and program coordinators listening to us who might be wondering, how can I do this so that everybody feels as comfortable as possible, or have that conversation? Because like I've gotten emails from people who say, I think there's somebody on the spectrum in my group, but the parents haven't said anything and the youth hasn't said anything. And the facilitator, I'm like, it's not your job to diagnose, but having those conversations, how do you open up that conversation if you don't know?
Yeah. So I guess there's one experience that I have this. So first off, places to sit, to make sure that or stand potentially, to make sure that everyone has a chance to sit in a place that's comfortable to them. Also, I think that it's another thing that might be important to think about is that oftentimes consistency can be really important for autistics. So I just remember anytime I have been in a class, like not just for church, but for any class for school, I always need to sit in the same place. And if I'm not sitting in the same place, then I'm going to be totally distracted for like the first 30 minutes. And as I said, you met one autistic. That might not necessarily be the experience for all the people on the spectrum that you might have, but that is certainly something to take into account. So again, it comes down to options. Listening. If someone says, "Hey, this is my seat, and I need this to be my seat," then try to make sure that you're accommodating that.
Thank you. We're getting you're cutting in and out, so you might be going into a bridge or a city or something where the signal is a little flaky there. How do you tell because we touched on this a little bit, but how do you tell when somebody like checking in on people without being intrusive? If you're questioning if the person is totally turned off, or if they're operating on a way that is comfortable for them. One of the things that we can be mindful of in OWL, we're not quizzing anybody. There aren't, we always give people the right to pass. But I think sometimes it's easy when you're leading a training or you're facilitating, if no one is responsive, then you feel like you have to do something to engage people. So what would be your recommendation for politely checking in with people without making them defensive or feeling that they've been intruded on?
So one of the difficult things with autism is knowing if someone with autism is paying attention to you, because we don't usually give the same signals that other people give. And sometimes it can be really extreme. I'll tell a brief story about myself to illustrate this. When I was in college, I was in a chemistry class taking a final exam, and I was in hyper focus. Anyone looking at me from outside, the fact that I was taking the exam, they probably would have expected focus, except that the fire alarm went off. Everybody evacuated. I didn't notice. I was completely focused on my test. My professor noticed that I hadn't left, came back to get me, came to shake me to get me to leave. And I said, "Don't bother me. Can't you see I'm trying to take a final exam?" To him, I appeared to be catatonic. The only proof that I had to show to anybody that I was not catatonic was the fact that I got an A on that exam. My concentration was working, it was paying off, but nobody would have known from looking at me. um, sometimes you're not going to know if somebody with autism is paying attention, and you might have to decide to just get used to that and accept it. You know, this isn't true with just autistics. We never know for sure which things are sinking in with which students. But we hear stories years later and we find out that it really was, even if we weren't sure it was at the time. One thing you can do is talk to the person before the whole thing starts and ask, what do you look like when you're paying attention? How will I know? Are there things that I could do to check in with you to find out that will work? Can we set up a code of some sort that I can communicate with you and you can communicate with me about what's going on? Nathan often established codes ahead of time with his teachers for that purpose. And when he was younger, Shellie and I would introduce the idea, but as he got older, he would come to the teacher and negotiate it himself.
I'm hearing this wonderful theme of
Can you hear me okay?
communication, right? Like, don't assume things, check in with people, ask. And, you know, maybe there's a situation where it is a quote, discipline issue or challenging behavior that doesn't have anything to do with the disability. And one of the ways to find that out is to talk to the people, right? And find out and try things and communicate. Shellie, did you
Sure. When you're not sure if it's discipline or disability,
Sure.
you can ask. It probably is more charitable to go ahead and assume that it's not a discipline issue to begin with and go on that assumption until you're told otherwise by the person themselves.
Shellie, did you want to jump in here?
I'm wondering if you can hear me.
Yes, we can. Yes.
You can hear me, okay. So if you don't have that arrangement set up ahead of time, one thing that you can do is observe, and you'll find that there will be little signs that the person is paying attention. Maybe they make a comment, etc. Occasionally people on the spectrum will comment something that appears to be unrelated to the topic. And what I would suggest is assume that it is related, assume that they are attending and have been attending, and ask, hey, how does this relate to what we were just talking about? And inevitably, it's called runaway associative thinking. People on the spectrum do it all the time, and it's kind of fun. But inevitably, they will have a line of thinking that got them from the topic to what they just said. And then, of course, as facilitators, we can bring that back, bring the topic back around.
Yeah. I think that's, yeah. So if somebody says, no, that's off topic, that would be a harmful thing to say. But yes, asking about the connection is helpful. I'm wondering, on a pragmatic sense, what are some of the things that when we're teaching about condom use or contraceptives, are there things that would be helpful little bits of information that would be useful to folks who might have some sensitivity or tactile issues?
I wasn't sure whether I should answer or throw that to Nathan if we can hear him.
Nathan, would you like to answer that?
Can you repeat the question? It's just
Yeah. So not in terms of the curriculum or the classroom management, but just in terms of when we're teaching about using contraceptives or condoms or lubricants or any of that practical stuff, is there something that would be helpful for facilitators to know to sort of add into the conversation?
I mean, I guess there's a few angles that I'm thinking about approaching that. I guess one of the things that was helpful for me in terms of learning was, you know, demonstrated on Woody's. You know,
So basically, actually handling condoms. One of the things that came up a lot at our last facilitator training, Raymond, was we had some facilitators in training who had some pretty significant sensory sensitivities. And so they actually requested ahead of time, whenever there was going to be an exercise that might involve that they were given that information. And so with regard to condoms, before the demonstrations, etc., to actually state, hey, if you have a sensory sensitivity, just know that the lubrication in terms of condoms can be pretty difficult.
Yeah. Also, one of the things that I think that a lot of autistics often struggle with is when they're lied to. And if you went to a public school that treated contraceptives the way that mine did, you were lied to a lot about contraceptives. I mean, it was basically every time they should have said the word consent, they said abstinence. And basically all I learned is that condoms always break, so they're completely useless. And the only way that you can preserve your purity is by never having sex. And I mean, since I had the parents that I had, I knew that was wrong. But I feel like there's a lot of people on the spectrum that might be in states or in places or in parts of a state where the education regarding contraceptives is just not accurate and not honest. So one of the demonstrations that I remember my parents doing was they to demonstrate how strong condoms were. My dad actually did this experiment where he put one in his car for like 5 years, like in his hot car for 5 years, and then took it out and then blew it up, and it grew enormous before it popped, just to like emphasize the durability. Obviously you should never store condoms like that, but like just to emphasize the durability and to emphasize that if you are getting information that says that contraceptives are useless, it's just not accurate.
So about sensory sensitivities, I sometimes hear facilitators preferring to use non-lubricated condoms for demonstrations and for practice and races and things like that, because they don't want people to feel gross because of the lubricant. And I would caution not to do that. I appreciate people being concerned about not wanting to trigger sensory sensitivities, but we actually want people to use lubricated condoms rather than unlubricated condoms. And if they've got a feeling like that about lube, some exposure to it is likely to be helpful rather than hurtful. But Shelley's point about giving people notice, it's a lot easier to face a sensory sensitivity when you know it's coming than it is when it just kind of sprung on you. And, you know, you can, a lot of people with autism will have sensitivities about sex in general that are related to sensory sensitivities. And there are accommodations that you can make for yourself in sex, you know, towels, damp towels, wipes, cleanup supplies. There are lots of things you can do to try to deal with that. And you can do that in a demonstration too. You can make sure you've got, here's an idea that's probably way over the top and nobody's really going to do, but I learned it from one of my best friend's mother. When she served lobster at her home in Maine, she would always, immediately after people ate their lobster, she would serve these warm, wet towels that she had heated up in the microwave beforehand for people to use to clean off with. Why, you know, you could take a fine china plate with a warm, wet cloth and put it out for people after they've used their condoms and they're feeling slick from their lube. There are things you can do that don't necessarily compromise the learning opportunity.
I think that's delightful. And I think that there are probably a lot of people who, if they had a lover bring them a hot towel on a plate, they would like, marry me, please.
Right? I mean, really. And what I love is just the reframing here to help people have information so they can not be afraid and judgmental about certain things that just aren't what they have judged as typical. So this is just really, really beautiful and lovely. And I think that we're kind of easing into one of the last things that we were going to talk about, which is this idea that that we sometimes tend to asexualize people with disabilities. And I'd love to hear more from you all about that and about helping parents and to get kids
So can
the info
I
they
tell a quick story?
Sure.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Shellie. We can't hear you, Shellie.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so I was actually doing a regional ASECT training on autism and sexuality, and one of the participants, a psychotherapist, had talked to, and this was in metropolitan DC area, talked to a local psychiatrist.
We lost you after psychiatrist, Shellie.
On autism and sexuality, and you need to go to a training. The psychiatrist said, why would you be going to a training on autism and sexuality? Autistics don't have sex.
Ooh.
Yes, this is a psychiatrist in the metropolitan DC area. Now, this was years ago.
I guess that means I don't exist.
Obviously, people on the spectrum do have sex. Autism is extremely, it's one of the highest heritable conditions, neurobiological conditions that there is. So, of course, these folks have sex.
Yeah. And so I actually wrote my master's thesis about specifically autism and romance and like communication and that. One of the things that I found was not only do autistics, do most autistics feel sexual desire, they also tend to be more diverse in terms of what types of sexual desires. So like there is a higher proportion of people on the spectrum who are asexual than the general population, but it is still fairly a small proportion. But there's also a much higher proportion of people on the spectrum who might identify as gay or lesbian or bisexual or pansexual or some type of sexual fluidity. And I mean, when you throw gender in there too, like autistics also tends to have a more complex view of gender as well. So it's not only that autistics feel sexual desire, the ways that we do are often more diverse.
Thank you for that. And I think that just generally speaking, it can be, I think, an implicit or unconscious bias that people have that to asexualize people with disabilities, and not just autism, other disabilities as well. So
And
I appreciate
it's
that.
something that we need to be sensitive about, because I understand parents being terrified that their autistic child will become sexual, and they're worried about what the results might be, and they have reason to have fear. But denying an individual's sexuality is not a good response to that fear. It never has been. But as facilitators, we have to both.
I did do a training.
Gosh, I wish Shelley's sound was more clear. We have to be sensitive to those parents' concerns. I think what Shellie was going to talk about was a workshop she did specifically for parents, and this wasn't just spectrum parents, it was parents in general. But parents can be really afraid.
Can you hear me now?
Maybe.
Yes.
I'm sorry. This actually, the particular training I'm remembering, Raymond, was a autism support group, and again the topic was autism and sexuality. And wow, there was some parents there of a child who were just over the top, freaked out by the concept that their child might be a sexual being, and it was pretty concerning. And so there is some understanding in that individuals on the spectrum can be more vulnerable to situations in terms of sexuality on both sides of the coin, in terms of them being victimized or in terms of them being seen as predators. And to me, of course, that speaks to how incredibly important sexuality is.
So she meant to say how important sexuality education is.
Right?
When she dropped out.
Yeah.
Especially a comprehensive approach like OWL takes.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, not just fear-based. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm going to put a plug.
That I read when
I'm putting a
Melanie.
plug in the chat for the parents and caregivers as sexuality as educators curriculum. The version at the link that I posted is the UUA version, the UU version, and Amy will be posting a UCC version on her website pretty soon. But we don't have any workshops specific to autism, but the whole program is about helping parents and caregivers become more comfortable communicating with the young people in their lives about sexuality.
Yeah.
There was a question in the chat about language, and the person was noticing that sometimes it was person with autism, sometimes it was I'm an autistic. So what would you like to share about the language that people use?
Nathan said he'd like to speak to that, if that's okay.
I'll take this one. So I almost every single time I personally give a talk about autism, I get that question, because I usually use what we refer to as identity first language, which means that instead of qualifying it with person with autism, I usually just say like autistic. And there is often a very strong push among among medical practitioners, and even a lot of therapists to focus on at least there was to focus on person first language. But one of the things that there's been more and more of a movement on with a lot of people within the autism community is really accepting that identity first language, because in a lot of ways, the reason why people want to do person first language is because they don't want to define someone by their disability. But in a lot of ways, those of us that are on the autism spectrum, we are defined by our disability because it is an integral part of our personality. Now, I don't personally get offended if people want to say person with autism is if that's what they're more comfortable with, or if that's how they choose to identify themselves. I don't mind it one way or another. But the way I see it, if you're saying that you have to put, whenever you mention that somebody is autistic, you have to qualify that with a person. Well, the only difference between person with autism and autistic is the word person. And if you're saying you need that qualifier, you're basically implying that autistics aren't people to begin with. So at the end of the day, I think it comes down to personal preference. So if you're trying to figure out how to identify someone on the autism spectrum, like when you're talking about them, if they want you to refer to them as autistic or a person with autism, I would say wait and see how they identify themselves and then just use that.
And I think that's usually good advice about any kind of language. My go-to used to be to tell people, if you need to say something, start with person first until you're sure that someone would rather it be the other way around. But the more autistics I've talked to, the more I find it seems like a very strong majority really prefer the identity first language over person first language. It's probably safer to start that way and switch if someone would prefer that.
Thank you. Shellie, were you going to say something?
Yes. And actually, I think there's a movement towards that now. I know that things do that. The person first language is not really the go-to anymore.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we've heard that from other folks, that there's quite a divide in the disability community around that. So
what haven't we addressed that you think that facilitators and program coordinators should know?
I'm trying to think through what we've covered and what we haven't.
while you're thinking, Raymond, I just want to pop in and say this is another really good reason, this whole webinar and everything that you all have so generously shared with us today, is why Melanie and I have been on a broken record repeat over the years to not skip the disability workshops in our whole lives curricula. There's one in pretty much every level, and the topic is brought up in different ways in every level of the curriculum. And it's important to not skip over that and think, oh, we don't need that in our community.
One of the things I think we alluded to, but maybe weren't as specific as we should have been, is about accommodating different levels of participation in activities. And letting people decide, for example, in an activity that involves touch, whether or not they're actually comfortable with that touch, if they'd rather it be modified, or if they'd rather just kind of observe instead of participate. It's really, I think, inherent in the idea of the right to pass, but it's probably not enough to just say right to pass without talking about some examples. If something involves tasting something and you don't want to taste it, then don't taste it. If or maybe you want to taste it later when you've worked yourself up to it rather than at the time when everybody's watching. Or if it's something that involves touch, make sure that you model consent throughout and ask right before you touch. Don't just reach out and touch somebody because that's part of the activity. Make sure you've got consent right before you do that so it doesn't come as a surprise. And that's
Also,
not just for autistic people, it's for everybody.
Yes.
But I find that if you accommodate the same things that you would want to do to accommodate for autism are things that a lot of people would like to have, whether they're autistic or not.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Shellie, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say, it really helps before an exercise to let folks know what it involves, whether it's related to trauma history or sensory issues related to neurodiversity or what have you. It really does help to give people heads up before an exercise so that they can choose to bow out if they need to.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to return to just quickly was when Raymond, when you were talking about it's more than enthusiastic consent. I think that we don't often give young people a really good sense of what it means. Like, do you want me to touch you here? Or, how firmly do you want me to touch you? Do you have any recommendations for having, or do any of you have a recommendation for how to model those conversations? Like, how detailed can we get without embarrassing the 8th grader, but that's going to be helpful for some folks to have that kind of detail.
This will be our last word because we're coming right up to the top of the hour here.
So if something involves touch, I think it makes sense to describe that touch in the when you're asking. Like, for example, if I'm about to tape a piece of paper to somebody's back as part of an exercise, to say that that's what I'm doing, and I'm going to press lightly on the center of your back to get the tape to stick. And for the person to be able to say, you know what, I think if you hand it to me, I can put it on myself and that'll work better. So that people will have that option, or for them to say, the middle of my back isn't going to work, let's go with the shoulder. Negotiating each level. And I think people can decide for themselves on how extensive they need that negotiation to be.
So to bring that into a behavioral realm, we could say, so we're doing this with a sticky note, but this is the kind of conversations that you could have if you're with a partner.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah.
And what's perfect role modeling is, I love it. There's so many exercises in OWL that are just so superb in terms of modeling and giving young people a chance to really practice this important stuff.
It is. And we are so grateful to you all for being here today. We do need to wrap up our webinar today, but we want to just thank you so much again. And I really love the general idea that if you're going to make this inclusive for folks who are autistic, then that is something that a lot of people are going to appreciate as well. So I think those are wise words for us to take from this webinar today. So thank you all so much for being here.